Revolutionary Perspectives for Pakistan. Tariq Ali. The revolutionary upsurge which erupted in both parts of Pakistan from October 1968 to March 1969 and which resulted in the overthrow of the dictator Ayub, marks a turning point in the history of the Indo-Pak subcontinent. It shows quite clearly that despite the siege mentality of Pakistani politics, the fear of communist invasion in the Cold War years, the threat of India, etc., the masses have succeeded in breaking through the ideological straitjacket in which they had been confined since the coup of October 1958. What began initially as a student revolt and a revolt which for the first 2 months was sustained only by the heroism and determination of the Pakistani student movement, later enveloped the lower petty bourgeoisie and finally brought into play on a nationwide level the growing strength of the urban proletariat. The main feature of the upsurge was its spontaneity, and despite the fact that there had been a foretaste of this spontaneous working-class militancy during the 1966 railway workers' strike, the wildness with which the new upsurge burst on the Pakistani political scene took the established left parties completely by surprise. For the first few weeks the latter refused to intervene and dismissed the revolt as just another student struggle which would be crushed by the dictatorship with ease. There is reason to believe that the ruling class, too, was harboring the same misapprehension. In all fairness, it should also be mentioned that the student movement itself was not aware during the first phase of the struggle of the forces it had set into motion. It was only after the December incidents, when a student call for a general strike in some urban centers met with an immediate and total response from the workers, that the more conscious elements began to realize the real strength of the movement they had detonated. 43. The upsurge spread like fire and engulfed every single urban center in Pakistan. In West Pakistan, many small towns which had been thought to be politically insignificant now showed their mettle for the first time as the urban masses battled with the police and attacked private property. The joint student-worker battles with the army and police, factory occupations, giraus, the winning of unbelievably high wage demands by the workers and the possibility of dual power in some cities was not enough even to pose the question of a seizure of state power or to lead to an effective dual power situation. The main reason for this was the lack of a revolutionary vanguard party or even of small revolutionary groups of the sort which existed in France in May 1968, in Mexico in October 1968 and in Argentina at the beginning of 1969. For one whole week the structure of authority in Dhaka, the capital city of East Pakistan, had completely collapsed. All initiative lay in the hands of the Students' Action Committee, SAC. Instead of mobilizing the masses and starting to implement some of its 11-point demands or at least posing the question of their implementation, instead of declaring Dhaka a liberated city, the SAC took over the role of the bourgeois state, and its main triumph was to prevent the disruption of the cricket test match between Pakistan and the MCC. No effort was made by any grouping to set up a People's Council to govern the city with representatives from SAC, the peasant associations and the factories. The latter was clearly a possibility, as many militants admitted in private discussions afterwards, and if steps had been taken in that direction it would have transformed the situation overnight, so that when the bourgeois parties united under the framework of DAC, Democratic Action Committee, to start negotiating with Ayub, a People's Council would have been the alternative present to the masses. Despite the absence of revolutionary parties, there can be no doubt that the 5-month upsurge represented a major step forward for the toiling masses in Pakistan. One, it produced a growing feeling of self-confidence among the masses and a realization of their own strength. This leap of consciousness enabled the masses, in particular the industrial working class, to continue their struggle for better working conditions and higher wages after the upsurge had been halted by the imposition of martial law and the takeover of power by the Army CNC, General Yahya Khan. Despite stringent military regulations banning strikes, there has been a continuation of the strike wave in both parts of the country since March 1969, which continues to the present time. Again, the most startling aspect of the strike wave has been its spontaneity. The trade union movement in Pakistan is extremely weak and the bulk of the official trade union leaders are either in the pay of the government or the bosses, and sometimes receive money from both. This has led to a great and spontaneous militancy at factory level. Despite the fact that workers have been shot dead by police during lockouts or that their leaders have been imprisoned and whipped, the government has been unable to halt the strike wave. And it was precisely in order to restrain the mass movement that the military government was forced to offer concessions such as the promised general election for October 1970, which has been postponed to December because of the floods in East Pakistan, on the basis of adult franchise. There can be no doubt that the election campaigns of the bourgeois and reformist parties have succeeded in diverting the militancy, but the ruling class is miscalculating if it imagines that a liberal democratic regime will be able to contain the movement. The exact opposite will be the case, as the limited freedoms which any elected government will be forced to concede will give rise to an extension of political struggles and more coordinated factory rebellions. To visualize the future political development of Pakistan, it is essential to define its historical background and the class structure of Pakistani society, which reveals the two options open to the country: gradual disintegration supervised by the United States, or socialist revolution. Historical background: the state of Pakistan emerged in 1947 as a result of the combined and uneven development of two national bourgeoisies in the Indian subcontinent. But whereas the Hindu bourgeoisie was capable of creating and sustaining its own political party, the Indian Congress, a party which, despite the recent split, has succeeded in preserving and maintaining bourgeois continuity and hegemony in India since partition, its Muslim counterparts were too weak to create their own party, and instead supported the Muslim League. The League was a feudal formation which had been created in 1906 by Muslim nobles and landowners because they felt it was necessary to foster a sense of loyalty to the British government among the Muslims of India. The feudal landlords financed the party and exercised control over it. Although the balance of forces was modified by the influx of petty bourgeois elements in the late 30s, the latter could never exercise complete control, despite the abilities of their leader, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who became Pakistan's first Governor-General after independence. Jinnah's death a year after in 1948 removed the last restraint from the landlords. The Muslim masses, who had been beguiled by slogans of a paradise on earth during the struggle for Pakistan, saw that it was the Muslim landlords who had acquired a country. From 1948-58 Pakistan witnessed a decade of parliamentary government, but without a single general election. The most important development was the complete disintegration of the Muslim League in the provincial elections in East Pakistan in 1954, where a League majority was smashed by a united front opposition which won 300 seats out of 310. The defeat of the League in the East was followed by a growing anti-feudal movement in the West, and it was becoming clear that a general election might result in a government not firmly committed to United States imperialism. It was to forestall such an election that General Ayub seized power in October 1958. Given the class nature of the army and the social background of the officer elite, a Nasrite direction was ruled out from the first day of military dictatorship. From 1958 to 1968 there was no generalized challenge to Ayub's power. The propaganda machine of the Ayub regime, both internally and externally, mainly via the Times and the Guardian, presented a picture of glowing economic progress, reform, stability, etc. It is therefore only essential to study the class structure of Pakistani society to see that nothing much changed during the decade of darkness. 1. Class structure of West Pakistan. West Pakistan consists of 4 provinces: Punjab, Sindh, Baluchistan, and the Northwest Frontier Province, NWFP. The countryside. The landlords. The landlords in the Indian subcontinent were largely a creation of British imperialism, in a situation where previously the land had either been owned by village communities or in the possession of the tiller. It is not surprising that the feudal landlords have been the most subservient and servile defenders of British imperialism. 3. In Pakistan today they represent the most reactionary and backward element, and whilst their loyalty has usually remained with the Muslim League or the various rump parties which have emerged from it, this has not prevented them from transferring it to the army when the occasion demanded it. The so-called land reforms which were carried out by the Ayub regime and were hailed as a landmark by the British press, in fact left intact the entire system of feudal relationships in the countryside. Only 1/6% of the cultivable land was redistributed, so it is not surprising that the land reform was welcomed by all the leading landlords once they had experienced its implementation. The big landlords today are those who own more than 100 acres of cultivable land. According to the 1963 agricultural census, they number 63,348, and between them own over 15 million acres of land, which constitutes 31.2% of the total land under private ownership. The big landlords represent 125% of the total number of landowners, and of these 0.12%, just under 6,000 landlords, own 11.5% of the total area. The politics of the provinces which comprise western Pakistan are dominated by these landlords, and the different political parties spend a lot of their time trying to win them over in order to ensure an equitable distribution of seats in the countryside, where 75.5% of the population lives. While the grip of the landlords over the cities has been broken over the last few years by the growing petty bourgeoisie and the deepening maturity of the proletariat, it is still likely that the landlords will dominate West Pakistani politics after the 1970 general election. Rich peasants. The Pakistani Kulaks own land varying between 25 and 100 acres, and number 286, 470. The area owned by them amounts to just over 10 million acres, or 21.9% of the total. These are the forces of the rural bourgeoisie, and while they undoubtedly nurture a resentment against the big landlords, they will never join hands with the poor peasants or peasant proprietors in a struggle against the feudal order. In a situation where the peasant movement shows signs of developing, they might give verbal support to avoid being isolated, but they pin their hopes on the bourgeois parties gradually transforming and bourgeoisifying the countryside. Until now they have been politically subservient to the big landlords, and it will need a strong bourgeois party to win them away from feudalism. They comprise in the countryside the bulk of the upper petty bourgeoisie, they are the moneylenders dreaded by every poor peasant, and while they work on their own land, they use their profits to hire landless laborers to work for them, thus helping to increase their surplus, which enables them to buy more land. Middle peasants. The middle peasants own between 5 and 25 acres. The total area under their control is 15,438, 138 acres, which represents 31.7% of the total. However, the statistics do not reveal the percentage of land which is uncultivable or without water supply. In fact, a large proportion of the land is as good as useless, and the real statistics have yet to be worked out. In most cases the middle peasants are self-supporting, but the existing economic conditions make this an extremely hard grind, and they are constantly forced to work harder to earn the same money. In times of crisis they may be forced to sell their land to the rich peasant and either move to the cities or become landless laborers. Their experience forces them to be hostile to the rich, but before they join any radical movement they have to be convinced of its partial success, because in the case of failure they have everything to lose and nothing to gain. In any case they are not hostile to anti-feudal movements. Poor peasants. This category of peasants owns less than 5 acres of land. They number 266, 137 and constitute 64.4% of the total owners, but the total area under their ownership is just over 7 million acres or 15.25% of the total. If a further division is made of these statistics, a figure emerges of 742,216 peasants who own less than 1 acre of land, and as a result have to sell part of their labor to middle or rich peasants in order to stave off starvation. The figure does not include the families of these peasants, and even an extremely optimistic estimate would multiply it by 3. These semi-proletarian peasants should be discussed in conjunction with the peasants in the next category. Poor peasants/sharecroppers/rural proletarians. There are over 2.2 million landless peasants in West Pakistan who are tenant sharecroppers and who cultivate over half of the cultivated land in the province. The best part, half or sometimes even as much as 3/4, of the share is expropriated by the landlord, and the remainder is sometimes used by the peasant to feed his family and sometimes sold at the local market. The rights of these tenant peasants are virtually non-existent. The local police are in most cases on the payroll of the local landlord and readily comply with the latter's request to eject troublesome peasants. Despite the oppression, the tenant peasant lives in a paradise compared with the rural proletarian. They. 47. Latter has no land at all. He is compelled to work for big landlords and rich peasants. His existence is that of a slave, a serf. The money he earns, he may sometimes be paid in produce, is barely enough to feed himself or his family. He has no rights and works 112 hours a week. There are over 1 million landless laborers in West Pakistan and their number is slowly growing, with the increase of dispossessed tenants. These are the peasants who will form the backbone of any peasant rebellion. The suppressed anger which they contain in their hearts will one day burst forth with a fury which neither the landlords nor their supporters in the army will be able to contain. It will even make the violent rebellions of the Chinese peasantry look like dinner parties. These poor peasants will play a key role in the coming Pakistani revolution, and only they, together with their proletarian brothers in the cities, will be capable of ending the feudal order in the countryside. The towns. The national bourgeoisie. The main characteristic of the Pakistani bourgeoisie is its relative inexperience, as it came into its own only after the establishment of Pakistan in 1947. Politically it was not strong enough to form its own party, and in the pre-Pakistan period always relied on the Muslim League. After the partition it saw the growing disintegration of the League, and hitched its star firmly to the Civil Service of Pakistan, CSP. The latter has therefore openly played the role of acting on behalf of the Pakistani bourgeoisie, with the result that the latter has never really felt the need to set up its own political party. Its interests have always been well defended. It is somewhat of an anomaly to refer to the Pakistani bourgeoisie as national in any meaningful sense of the word. They are tied to American finance capital and also to British capital. While the near-monopoly positions of the big businessmen enabled them to obtain well over 100% profits, their links to independence in relation to foreign capital were an essential prerequisite for this economic miracle. The dependence on foreign capital has been increasing over the last decade. Total capital imports have increased by 100% from 1955 to 1965, and the projected increase for 1965-70 was given as another 100%. Also 32% of the development expenditure is entirely dependent on foreign aid, which can be used only in consultation with us economic advisors, the civilian version of the advisors currently engaged in Indochina. By 1968 the chief economist of the Pakistan Planning Commission revealed that 22 leading industrialists controlled 66% of the industrial assets of the country, 70% of insurance and 80% of banking interests. At the same time 25% of the total labor force was unemployed, including seasonal unemployment. While there has undoubtedly been an increase in the rate of industrialization, this has not resulted in an increase in the standard of living for 90% of the population of Pakistan. The industrialization has been supervised by the givers of foreign aid and has been accompanied by tax exemptions, tariff protections, export bonus schemes. 48. Cheap government loans, etc. The Pakistani capitalist has in addition enjoyed the right to charge the highest possible price for the goods he manufactures. This bourgeoisie is incapable even of thinking of the bourgeois democratic revolution in the countryside, and to countenance any alliance with it is to betray the class interests of the workers and poor peasants. Leading members of the bourgeoisie are now beginning to support certain political parties, in particular after the 1968-69 upsurge, which shattered their complacency to a certain extent, the particular party they join depending on what they think are its chances of success in the general election. But the loyalties of the bourgeoisie as a class still lie with the army and the civil service, as both these groupings have proved to be the most efficient defenders of the status quo. The petty bourgeoisie. This class is never united or cohesive. The upper petty bourgeoisie comprises small businessmen who have a hard time maintaining their small rate of profit, and like their counterparts in the countryside, are seriously affected by any economic crisis. Many of them are ruined by the costs of inflation. Others find themselves unable to find enough money to bribe the relevant civil servant in order to renew their import or export licenses. They are still determined to try and get rich, and this dominates their political outlook, hence they are in most cases hostile to the revolutionary movement. They comprise the large shopkeepers, the petty bureaucrats, building contractors, the upper section lawyers, the teachers in high wage brackets. At a time when the upsurge was consciously adopting anti-capitalist slogans, the upper petty bourgeoisie together with the big bourgeoisie and the landlords welcomed the intervention of the Pakistan Army. The lower petty bourgeoisie comprises the bulk of the student community in Pakistan, in addition to a majority of teachers and junior lecturers at universities, technical colleges, etc. In Pakistan they have played a progressive role and have been in the vanguard of the struggle against dictatorship. Many of them, however, tend to be satisfied with democratic demands and fail to see that only a dictatorship of the urban and rural proletariat is capable of leading the struggle for even bourgeois democratic demands to a successful conclusion. As a class they have become extremely responsive to socialist ideas. They tend to support the left political parties, as we shall see below. The proletariat. The urban proletariat, small though it may be in numbers, is a crucial part of the leadership of the revolution. It was the workers who provided the backbone of the struggle in its last phase, and it is the workers who have continued the struggle and kept up an opposition to the regime. It was the same workers who defied the taunts of the neo-fascist Jamaat-e-Islami and observed May Day 1970 throughout West Pakistan with red flags and with the slogan, "Capitalists stand back, Pakistan belongs to us." For despite the harsh labor laws and the 10-year wage freeze institutionalized by Ayub, the 4CF. The Red Mole, August 1970, article entitled, Pakistan, New Vultures for Old. 49. Pakistani workers displayed a combativity reminiscent of the Russian workers before 1905. High unemployment, low wages, and a complete lack of organization have not prevented the workers from using their own imagination and initiative and winning certain victories. According to the last census, 1961, the total urban population had increased from 7,839,000 in 1951 to 12,255,000 10 years later, an increase of 56%. In West Pakistan there was an increase from approximately 6 million to 9 million, an increase of 59.7%. If one bears in mind the rapid rate of industrialization, the figure is bound to have increased considerably since then. The West Pakistani proletariat is concentrated in manufacturing industries, mining, communications, and transport. The town with the largest concentration of workers is the former capital, Karachi, though the cities of Lahore and Lyallpur are developing very fast, and with the start of work at the new machine tool centre near Rawalpindi the latter will become an extremely important area. Workers' organizations are extremely weak in West Pakistan, but this situation is being altered by the workers themselves, and a new crop of leaders is emerging, tested in class struggle, hard and uncompromising and prepared to face any oppression to defend their class interests. 2. East Pakistan and the national question. The province of East Bengal, known as East Pakistan, is separated from West Pakistan by 1,000 miles of Indian territory. The struggle for Pakistan in East Bengal was also a struggle by the majority of Muslim peasants against the Hindu landlords and money lenders. The Muslim League leaders successfully used this to gain power. The province of East Pakistan has therefore only one thing in common with West Pakistan: the Islamic religion. Given the different cultural and linguistic background in Bengal, and also the vigorous tradition of revolutionary nationalism, the link was never very strong at the best of times. The economic and political subjugation of East Pakistan, which began soon after partition, by West Pakistani landlords, civil servants, and the Pakistan Army has succeeded in further weakening this tenuous link. Economically it has been non-Bengali entrepreneurs who have been allowed to become millionaires, and politically the army and civil service has seen to it that the Bengali majority does not get fair representation on a national scale. Whether the December 1970 general election will change matters remains to be seen. The bourgeoisie. As mentioned above, the Bengali bourgeoisie has not been allowed to develop economically. Instead, West Pakistani capitalists have been allowed to exploit East Bengal in a neo-colonial fashion. Much of the profits from East Pakistan have contributed to the faster rate of industrialization in West Pakistan. This situation has gone from bad to worse, and it was bound to produce a nationalist response from the Bengali petty bourgeoisie, which has a much higher level of political consciousness than its Western counterpart. This is also true historically. Bengal was without doubt the most politically conscious segment of the Indian subcontinent during the days of the Raj, and it was not an exaggeration to say that what Bengal thinks today, 50. India thinks tomorrow. Not only has the Bengali bourgeoisie been dispossessed economically, but it has never been allowed adequate representation in either the civil service or the armed services. For instance, the number of Bengalis in the army is infinitesimal. This is because the ruling elite in the West does not trust the Bengalis because of their superior political culture. The rationalization is racist: the Bengalis are short and weak and not capable of fighting. The latter view is widespread in the army and the civil service. Unfortunately, the left forces in West Pakistan have often shared these prejudices. The Bengali middle class has its own political party, the Awami League, which is committed to some extent to reversing the existing situation. The agrarian question. The population density in East Bengal is amongst the highest in the world, and it is certainly much higher than that of West Pakistan. The pressures on the land are therefore much greater. In West Pakistan the total surveyed area is 104 million acres, in East Bengal it is just over 21 million acres. A limited land reform implemented in East Pakistan a few years after independence, the East Pakistan Acquisition and Tenancy Act 1950, placed land ownership at a ceiling of 33 acres and abolished the role of middlemen or rent collectors. The reason for this measure was of course the fact that most of the landlords affected were Hindu landlords, and it had the effect of driving them out of the country. The land obtained by this means was given to those peasants who were working on it or redistributed. Feudalism of the West Pakistan variety, therefore, does not exist in East Pakistan. What does exist in the countryside is a decaying feudalism with a strong Kulak class. The number of poor peasants is increasing fairly rapidly. The peasants owning less than 5 acres own the largest area of land, 734 acres, and of this 3.12 million acres are held in holdings of less than 2.12 acres. Over 4 million peasants and their families come into this category. The number of tenant sharecroppers is low compared with West Pakistan, only 100,000, while the landless labourers account for 1.4 million peasants and their families. Also there are 3.2 million peasants whose land holdings are so small that they have to work part-time as labourers in order to survive. The number of landless labourers and those owning small pieces of land is roughly equal. However, the number of landless labourers is on the increase. Peasants with small land holdings are often forced to sell their land. Moreover, every time a peasant dies his land is divided equally amongst his heirs, and this increases the fragmentation of land holdings tenfold, making them virtually worthless. The poor peasant with a small land holding is taxed heavily by the government. He pays land tax in addition to tax on every commodity he produces, including even the small mud hut he builds for himself. If he is behind in paying his tax, his land is subject to confiscation. During the 1968-69 upsurge, many peasants stopped paying taxes. In certain areas the regime's local bully boys were tried before a people's court and on certain occasions condemned to death. The fear of confiscation increases the peasants' indebtedness, putting more power in the hands of the kulaks, who lend money at extortionate interest rates. 51. The situation has deteriorated rapidly over the last decade, but even as far back as 1961 the statistics provided a grim picture of the Bengali countryside. 52% of the peasants tilled their own land, but a large majority of them were poverty-bound smallholders. The average family farm is 3.5 acres, but 51% of the farms are less than 2.5 acres. Landless laborers form 26% of all cultivators. The latter figure has undoubtedly risen by between 12 and 15% over the last 9 years. A serious famine situation has existed in the countryside over the last 3 years. Rice production has dropped and the price of rice has risen by 30%. The statistics for death from malnutrition have not yet been revealed, but they are bound to have increased greatly. In certain areas strong peasant associations exist, but they have not yet succeeded in mobilizing the peasantry on a province-wide basis, though certain areas in North Bengal have established a reputation for militancy. The proletariat. Owing to the low level of industrialization, the rate of growth of the urban population in East Pakistan has been much lower. The first and second 5-year plans, 1955-65, quite blatantly allocated more funds for developing the western province, and the actual expenditure in East has been less even than the planned expenditure. There is also a constant drain of capital resources, as they are regularly transferred from the East to the West. Despite the fact that Bengali jute has provided the province with a favorable balance of foreign trade, the foreign exchange earned by the jute has financed projects in West Pakistan. In addition, goods manufactured in West Pakistan are sold at higher prices in the eastern province. Neither the third nor the fourth 5-year plans made any serious effort to redress this balance. As a result, it is not surprising that the increase of urban population in East Pakistan was from 4% in 1951 to 5.2% in 1961. The similar period in West Pakistan showed an increase from 17.8% to 24.5%. Even the average monthly income of a working-class family in East Pakistan is marginally lower than it is in West Pakistan. The national question. Because of all the factors outlined above, the national question plays an increasingly important role in Bengali political life, and unless the revolutionary left in both parts of the country understands and comes to grips with this question, it will not be able to achieve the much wider emancipation which is undoubtedly on the agenda. The national question, coupled with the combined and uneven development of political consciousness in the two parts of the country, could well lead to a situation where the revolution is successful in Bengal before it moves to the west. In this situation, revolutionary socialists will be faced with the possibility of protracted struggles in the east and the need to combat chauvinism in the west. Whether or not East Bengal becomes the Yemen of the Indian subcontinent depends entirely on political leadership, its relative strength, state of preparedness and capacity to understand the dynamics of the permanent revolution. 52. The state of the left in East and West Pakistan. The Communist Party in Pakistan did not have an auspicious start. All its cadres, the word is used in its broadest sense, were told to enter the Muslim League and support those who were trying to put forward progressive ideas. This followed from the position of the Communist Party of India, which supported the partition and tried to promote a joint struggle for independence by the Congress and the Muslim League 5 when the Communist Party of Pakistan emerged with a public face. Its leadership, in West Pakistan, which was composed largely of Muslim intellectuals sent across by the CPI, found itself incapable of the twists and turns required of it by Moscow. It was enmeshed in an attempted putsch which finished it completely in West Pakistan in 1951. In the East, it was more successful and has maintained an underground party of sorts continuously since the partition. However, the Pakistani Communists have never developed any real perspective of building an independent revolutionary party to struggle for the socialist revolution. The reason for this is their belief in the Stalinist theory of revolution by stages, coupled with their obsession for popular front-type maneuvering. And while the Chinese Revolution did change this attitude as far as the more advanced cadres were concerned, on the whole the party stuck to its original concepts. It was not till the Sino-Soviet split that the question of socialist revolution was taken really seriously. The members of the CPP in both parts of the country virtually gave up independent activity and entered the ranks of various progressive groupings where some of them attained positions of leadership. These groupings later merged to set up the National Awami Party in 1957. It was in this party that many of the old Stalinists finally found their home. The National Awami Party, NAP, consisted of a weird collection of liberals, social democrats, nationalists, and Stalinists. The party did carry out some useful activity in the anti-imperialist field, but a more important factor in radicalizing consciousness was Progressive Papers Limited, a group which was owned by a leading NAP politician, Iftikharuddin, and which published the Pakistan Times and Imroz. Both daily newspapers achieved a mass circulation and voiced the feelings of the Popular Front politicians. They were undoubtedly the most important left force in the country and were seized by the Ayub government a few months after it came to power. Despite the various opportunities offered to them, the Stalinists proved incapable of struggling for or popularizing socialism. Their failure to explain developments in the Soviet Union and their blind adherence to Moscow were further factors in this process. In 1967 the NAP split into pro-Soviet and pro-Peking factions. These splits were carried out by the Stalinists working in the party, and their non-communist partners seemed a bit puzzled by the reasons they were given for the split. Taking advantage of the opportunist policy of the Peking government towards the Ayub dictatorship, the pro-Peking NAP decided to cease opposing the regime, a course in which they were undoubtedly advised by Peking. 6. The pro-Moscow faction was only interested in bourgeois democracy and so opposed the regime from a liberal standpoint. The capitulation of the latter and the adaptation of the former to Chinese state policy meant that there was no left party capable of carrying out a struggle against the dictatorship. It was in this vacuum that Zulfikar Bhutto, a former foreign minister of Ayub's, set up the People's Party, after he had been dismissed owing to State Department pressure. Bhutto's radical demagogy and his outspoken attacks on the Ayub regime won him a certain following, and when the upsurge started he was the only politician who could support it and take advantage of it. The pro-Peking NAP continued to insist that the Ayub regime was anti-imperialist until it had no option but to be forced onto the streets by its rank and file. In the east, the pro-Peking faction was led by the peasant leader, Maulana Bashani, whose political instinct was much sharper than that of his theoreticians. He realized the potential of the revolt and was the first leader in Bengal to issue a call for a general strike. But even there the Maulana's opportunism and his veiled support for Ayub had had its effect, and the NAP in East Bengal could offer no leadership. It simply tail-ended the mass movement and failed to grasp the importance of the national question. In this situation the vacuum was filled by the leader of the Bengali middle class, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, accurately nicknamed Chiang Kai-shek. Rahman's opposition to the Ayub regime had resulted in his imprisonment. When he came out of prison there were 1 million people to welcome him at a giant rally. He stepped in and filled the vacuum with his party, the Awami League. Both Bhutto and Rahman are opportunist right-wing social democrats, but both have mass followings in the urban centers of West and East Pakistan respectively. Their parties also contain some genuine left elements who are in a minority, but who will press their respective leaders to fulfill their promises if either of them assumes power after the general election. At the moment it seems that Mujibur Rahman will win a majority in East Pakistan and will then bargain with the winners in West Pakistan to form a centre-right coalition government. In the West, despite Bhutto's popularity, it is unlikely that he will win too many seats in the countryside, except in areas where he has signed pacts with the local landlords. His main strength will be in the cities. It is the old landlord parties who will come out strongest in West Pakistan, and it is they who Mujibur will have to come to terms with. The tasks of the left. There can be little doubt that a post-general election situation will allow revolutionists to perform open propaganda and agitational work. The task which confronts them is the building of a revolutionary vanguard as the independent expression of the workers and the poor peasants. The tragic defeat of the Indonesian CP, the opportunism of the CPI and the CPI-M, suggest that revolutionary Marxists will have to be very clear as to the main tasks of this vanguard. They will be faced with 5 key problems. 1. To form an independent political force of the urban and rural proletariat and to combat the ideological influence of the urban and rural bourgeoisie within the proletarian movement. 2. If the occasion arises, to give critical support to any real anti-imperialist move by the local ruling class, similar to the nationalization of Mexican oil, Suez Canal, Bolivian tin, foreign banks etc., while constantly explaining the limitations of the bourgeoisie which is compelled owing to its inner contradictions to carry out these policies. 3. To represent the most radical and energetic force within the anti-imperialist movement, not only by actions of solidarity with the struggles for national liberation in the three continents, but by linking these struggles to the revolutionary movement against one's own bourgeois class, whatever verbal stance it might have adopted. 4. To alert the working masses to the fact that a struggle against the bourgeoisie and upper petty bourgeoisie is essential for an overthrow of the existing social structure, and that the latter are incapable of mobilizing the masses against imperialism. 5. To fight on these political lines for the hegemony of the proletariat in the revolution. In concrete terms, this means the victory of the Proletarian Party in gaining the leadership of toilers in both town and countryside and leading them to overthrow the bourgeois state and establish the new socialist order. It is on this basis that a program for a revolutionary vanguard can be worked out. The prospects for a liberal democratic government in Pakistan are bleak. The Pakistan Army has grown accustomed to exercising direct political power, and it will not sit back and watch an increasingly powerful mass movement develop. There is a possibility that a military reformist current might well emerge inside the army itself, as there has been an influx of petty bourgeois elements from the cities, most of whom have different political ideas and beliefs than their predecessors. Also, the size of the army has increased tenfold since Ayoub's coup d'état of 1958. This means a diversification inside the ranks of the army itself. However, the key question confronting the left is one of organizing itself so that when the next upsurge occurs it will be in a position to lead it. Socialist revolution is definitely on the agenda in East and West Pakistan. What is in doubt is whether Pakistani revolutionaries are capable of ensuring that it can achieve victory. Introduction to Day Modern. On June 26, Indira Gandhi introduced a state of emergency which led immediately to the arrest of several hundred opposition leaders and to the imposition of a draconian press censorship on the country's normally vigorous bourgeois press. Emboldened by the feeble response to these measures, Indira Gandhi induced the Lok Sabha, lower house of the Indian Parliament, not merely to ratify the state of emergency but to abolish retroactively the electoral offences of which she had been found guilty on June 11. A notable feature of Indira Gandhi's constitutional coup was the smoothness of its execution and the responsiveness of the state machine to the orders it was receiving. In fact, the events following June 26, however unexpected, had been well prepared by the whole preceding development and notably by a great expansion in the size and role of the state repressive apparatus. Although the international press was silent on the fact, there were already tens of thousands of political prisoners in Indian jails on June 26. These had been jailed following the Naxalite revolts of the late 60s and early 70s, the attack on the CPM in West Bengal and the brutal suppression of the railway workers' strike in March 1974. The latter was indeed, in the words of the introduction to Explosion in a Subcontinent, an ominous further step towards establishing a Bonapartist regime in India. Moreover, the failure of the Indian left, and in particular the divided forces of Indian communism, to wage an effective campaign. 31. Against this wave of repression was to prove a green light for the present wholesale assault on democratic rights. The immediate events that precipitated Indira Gandhi's coup were the judgment against her in the Allahabad court for electoral malpractices, and the defeat of Congress in the Gujarat elections earlier in June after a personal intervention by the Prime Minister. These events were exploited to the full by the motley opposition which joined together the communalist Jan San, the Morarji Desai Congress and the reactionary mystagogue J.P. Narayan. Beneath these opposition forces was a surge of spontaneous social revolts against high prices, hoarding, smuggling and corruption. The demagogy of the opposition was fed by the manifest failure of successive Congress administrations to galvanize Indian capitalism and enable it to offer some hope to the many-millioned peoples of the subcontinent. 2. The repercussions of the world capitalist recession on the Indian economy have intensified the intractable problems confronted by India's rulers and have reduced the scope for open political competition between different representatives of the ruling class. But the relative weakness of Indian capitalism by no means implies that the Indian bourgeoisie is a weak or inconsiderable force. Indira Gandhi's bold move to acquire an unfettered leadership of this class reflects the narrowing options facing Indian capitalism and the political weakness of the worker and peasant masses, but not any lack of political initiative. 3. The Indian ruling class is paying a minimal price for its failures because it faces no serious socialist antagonist, capable of mobilizing those masses against their oppressors and exploiters. The bourgeois opposition to Indira Gandhi was able to gain its momentum because of the passivity of the left and its complicity with some of the worst aspects of the traditional order in India. Despite its present defeat, this opposition still represents an alternative bourgeois combination should Indira Gandhi follow too closely the path of the late Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. By contrast, no section of the left now presents such an alternative despite the considerable resources that have been at its disposal and despite the extremity of the economic and social crisis in India. Yet at the time of independence, Indian communism was a mass political force, capable of challenging Congress dominance in a number of important areas. In the interview that follows, K. Damodaran traces the historical development of the CPI and gives an account of the splits which were to overtake it in the 60s. Damodaran became actively involved in anti-imperialist, nationalist politics in the late 20s and was imprisoned as a result. In prison he engaged in discussions with a wide range of left militants, and soon after his release he joined the CPI. He helped to found the communist unit in Kerala together with EMS Namboodiripad, A.K. Gopalan and others. By working inside the Congress Socialists, the Kerala Communists acquired a mass base in the state which was to become a stronghold of the CPI after independence. In 1956 Damodaran was to become a member of the CPI National Council, the local equivalent of the Central Committee, on which he served for 12 years. He also represented the CPI for 6 years in the Rajya Sabha, Upper House, in the late 60s. Damodaran was not only an important mass leader for the CPI in Kerala, but also a writer and playwright of some repute, whose agit-prop dramas were extremely popular with audiences in the countryside and cities. In an article written in May 1974, Damodaran quoted the following passage from Marx: "Proletarian revolutions constantly engage in self-criticism, and in repeated interruptions of their own course. They return to what has apparently been accomplished in order to begin the task again. With merciless thoroughness they mock the wretched aspect of their first attempts." In this interview Damodaran is not merciless, but he nonetheless sheds a much-needed and timely light on the failures of Indian communism. Through the twists and turns of party policy, the CPI sacrificed the development of the mass organizations and an independent proletarian line for the sake of short-lived adventures or coalitions with the most reactionary political forces. In the early 20s the tiny groups of Indian communists were encouraged to initiate a military struggle for liberation long before the preconditions for such a struggle were present. The Comintern under Lenin and Trotsky did not grasp the specific nature of the Indian social formation nor correctly assess the strength of the bourgeois nationalism of Congress. It was insistently maintained that Congress would not undertake a struggle against British rule. This error was to be greatly compounded in the Comintern Third period, during which Indian communists became completely isolated from the mainstream of the nationalist movement. Congress was denounced as being a vulgar tool of British imperialism. The turn towards popular fronts inaugurated by the 7th Congress of the Comintern was to witness the emergence of the CPI as a nationally organized force. In this period the CPI grew from no more than 150 members to nearly 5,000 members. With the outbreak of the Second World War the CPI first opposed any support for Britain and France and then, following the invasion of the Soviet Union, gave wholehearted allegiance to the war effort, acting as a recruiting sergeant for the British Armed Forces just at the time when the Congress leadership was launching its Quit India movement against British rule. Yet again the CPI was out of step with the development of the national movement. At the time of independence the CPI switched to support for both Congress and the Muslim League, endorsing the religious division of the subcontinent. In the late 40s, after denouncing the Congress government as a British puppet, the CPI embarked on a series of armed uprisings in areas where it had gained mass influence. The mid-50s saw another sharp turn. Congress was hailed as a progressive anti-imperialist force and the party dedicated itself to acquiring the parliamentary seats that would, it was hoped, enable it to inflect Congress to the left. 33. Damodaran argues that the eventual split in the CPI in the 60s, leading to the creation of the CPM, did not concern the basic question of whether the CPI should break with its parliamentary, class collaborationist strategy, but rather the tactical question of which bourgeois allies were to be preferred in the pursuit of electoral advance. The CPI was prepared to give every political support to Congress, hoping one day to achieve a formal governmental coalition with it. It has continued to give the most servile support to Indira Gandhi, even after the suppression of the 1974 railway workers' strike and the qualitative turn to dictatorship of June 1975. Following the split with the CPI, the CPM displayed every readiness to ally itself with the most reactionary bourgeois opposition parties. During the most recent period, weakened by its setbacks in West Bengal, it has trailed along behind the campaign of Narayan. Following the imposition of the state of emergency, it proved incapable of mounting any resistance to Indira Gandhi. In their pursuit of different electoral combinations, the two communist parties were prepared to split the mass organizations of the Indian working class and peasantry, and to facilitate an increasingly arrogant and arbitrary assertion of the power of the capitalist state. Meanwhile, the Marxist-Leninist groups which split from the CPM, allegedly on the grounds of its opportunism, have been scattered and defeated after a succession of terrorist adventures. Some ML groups even allowed themselves to become instruments of Congress thuggery against the CPM. Despite the courage and dedication of thousands of communist militants, their best efforts have been continually squandered and falsified by the strategic conceptions of the leaders of Indian communism. These conceptions led them repeatedly to misconstrue the nature of the state and the social formation in India, to subordinate themselves to the political agents of imperialism and capitalism, and to interrupt the development of the mass movement. Occasional bouts of adventurism and terrorism only served to consolidate a fundamentally class collaborationist and electoralist strategy. 4. This interview with Damodaran was conducted shortly before the declaration of the state of emergency. Nothing that has happened subsequently does anything but confirm his bleak and pessimistic balance sheet of Indian communism. Yet the necessary task of identifying the failures and mistakes of the past will assist the Indian left to meet its historic responsibilities in the future. The reader will also discover that this personal memoir by an Indian communist gives many insights into the development of the international movement of which he was a part. Despite his many disappointments, Damodaran still draws inspiration from the advances of the revolutionary movement elsewhere in the world and is confident that the forces accumulated in the past by Indian communism could be regrouped and recuperated by a genuinely revolutionary strategy in the subcontinent. Tariq Ali. Tariq Ali. The struggle in Bangladesh between the Bengali Liberation Forces and the armed might of West Pakistani capital represents both a continuation of the mass movement which erupted in 1968-69 and a qualitative break. In that sense, we can say that the present course of events in East Bengal was not unpredictable. 1. The war in Bangladesh is an event of the greatest international significance. Its immediate effects extend well beyond the present frontiers of conflict, and in the long term it may well be seen as a decisive phase of the Indian Revolution. Together with the uprising in Ceylon, it signals the approaching demise of traditional bourgeois politics in the entire subcontinent and puts armed struggle on the agenda for the not-too-distant future. The implications of this for the politico-military strategy of imperialism in Asia are evidently very serious ones. Bangladesh. Results and prospects. 27. It is therefore vital for Marxists to study in detail the present stage of the struggle and the path towards the ultimate liberation of the Indian subcontinent. There have been two distinguishing features of politics in eastern Bengal since the beginning of 1971, on the one hand, the enthusiastic participation of the masses in every level of an escalating social and national struggle, and on the other the political bankruptcy of the petty bourgeois notabilities of the Awami League, whose whole tradition of compromise and maneuver rendered them completely incapable of providing leadership in a real independence movement. Even before the formal invasion took place on March 25, 1971, this tradition had led to the loss of hundreds of Bengali lives at the hands of the oppressor army of General Yahya Khan. These earlier demonstrations of its brute power should have convinced the Awami League politicians of what was likely to follow unless they prepared the Bengali people for a protracted struggle. This they refused to do despite the evident desire of the masses, expressed in thunderous slogans at Awami League meetings, for a total break with Pakistan. The rising tide of popular political consciousness was already clear in the enormous meetings which took place throughout the province both before and after the general election of 1970. At every stage the masses assimilated the lessons of the past much more rapidly than their parliamentarist leaders and showed their willingness to fight the colonial state in East Bengal. At every stage they were again and again checked by the visceral constitutionalism of the Awami League leadership. This conflict between the mass movement and the petty bourgeois outlook of its official guides was all the more tragic in that the existing organizations of the revolutionary left were localized and thus not in a position to influence the course of the struggle decisively. However, as we shall see, this situation is now beginning to change in favor of the revolutionary movement. The Awami League. The Awami League has been a party of reaction since birth. Its formative years were dominated by parliamentary maneuver and intrigue. Its main social roots have always been in the functionaries, teachers, petty traders, and shopkeepers who proliferate in East Bengali society. Its founder, H.S. Surawardi, who for a short time succeeded in becoming Pakistan's Prime Minister, distinguished himself in 1956 by supporting the Anglo-French-Israeli invasion of Egypt. He became one of the most articulate defenders of imperialist interests in Pakistan and American policy in Asia as a whole. Two left-wing parties and organizations in East Pakistan who opposed these policies were physically attacked by Awami League volunteers and had their meetings broken up with monotonous regularity. Surawardi's other notable achievement was to supervise the fusion of the provinces of Baluchistan, Sindh, and the northwest frontier into a single territorial unit dominated completely by Punjab. In this way he showed his respect for the autonomy of the West Pakistani provinces. After 1958, Surawardi played a dissident role during the early years of the Ayub dictatorship and was imprisoned for a short time as a result, but his opposition was always limited to the bourgeois constitutionalist framework. Surawardi's undoubted talents: he was a proficient lawyer, an artful political manipulator and a glib conversationalist, placed him head and shoulders above the rest of the Awami League leadership. His ambitions, however, were far removed from Bengali independence. His aim was to make the Awami League an all-Pakistan electoral machine, capable of winning power as a national party and thus catapulting H.S. Surawardi into the highest possible office. His untimely death in 1963 put an end to this dream. His successor, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, had won prominence as a party organizer and hatchet man rather than as an astute politician. The very idea of the Awami League disavowing the legacy of its dead leader was considered heresy of the worst sort under the new leadership. 3. It is essential to recall this early history in order to understand the recent attitudes of the League. It continued to play an oppositional role during the remaining years of the Ayub dictatorship. Ayub himself more than once considered the idea of reaching some compromise with its leaders and incorporating them in the central government, but the gangster politicians from the East Pakistani underworld, on whom he had relied for so long to maintain law and order in Bengal, constantly and successfully sabotaged this plan, as it would have meant the end of their own political careers. The Awami League was thus offered no choice but to continue as an oppositional force. It joined a multi-party alliance, combined opposition parties, in 1964 to field a candidate against Ayub, but the elections were rigged by the army and the civil service and the field marshal was returned with a comfortable majority. In March 1965, the opposition tried to regroup and met in Lahore to hammer out a joint strategy. It was here that the Awami League, in the person of Mujibur, dropped a bombshell in the form of its famous six-point plan for regional autonomy. The West Pakistani leaders were so shocked that they accused the Ayub regime's most Machiavellian civil servant, Altaf Gauhar, of having drafted them in order to split the anti-Ayub opposition. This marked the beginning of the gulf between Bengali nationalism and the West Pakistani oppositional parties. The abyss was to widen in the coming years. It was transcended for a time during the mass upsurge against Ayub in 1968-69, but the absence of a strong revolutionary party guided by Marxism-Leninism meant that it came to the forefront again as soon as the upsurge subsided. There were two important reasons why the Awami League was able to win mass support and hegemonize the politics of East Bengal. The first was its success in grasping the importance of the national question. The second was the failure of the groups of the extreme left, which had followed an extremely opportunist course during the Ayyub dictatorship because of the latter's friendship with China. Thus the Awami League could present itself as the only meaningful opposition force in the province. It constantly carried out propaganda in favor of its 6 points, it called for free elections and it organized demonstrations against the Ayyub dictatorship. Some of its leaders, including Mujibur Rahman, were consequently arrested. The Maoist wing of the National Awami Party, NAP, had meanwhile shown complete blankness towards the national problem. Instead of joining popular agitation and deepening it by explaining to the masses that national and democratic tasks can today only be solved within a socialist framework, and thus preparing them for a long struggle, they entrenched themselves in sectarian isolation. In other words, they failed to see that uneven historical development would oblige Bengali revolutionaries to work out a strategy for their struggle independent of West Pakistan. Moreover, they insisted that the Ayyub regime had certain anti-imperialist features and was therefore in some ways to be preferred to bourgeois democracy. In these conditions, the Awami League did not have much trouble in establishing itself as a powerful mass force. The stupidity of the Ayyub regime in persecuting its leaders, manufacturing conspiracy cases against them and throwing them into jail could only help this process. Thus when the anti-Ayyub upsurge resulted in the fall of the dictator and his replacement by the Yahya junta in early 1969, it was hardly surprising that the Awami League reaped the benefits. Yet it still could not disavow its heritage. In the weeks before the army persuaded Ayyub to retire, the Awami League eagerly participated in the constitutional talks at the round table conferences called by Ayyub to reach a compromise. It had fueled the mass movement and witnessed the anger of Bengali peasants and workers, even so it remained tied to its parliamentarist past. The Yahya military regime, unable to quell the mass upheaval in both parts of the country, was forced to promise a general election on the basis of adult franchise. Its advisers evidently believed it could concede this as a diversionary tactic. They were confident that the bureaucracy, from long experience in such matters, would be able to manipulate the results satisfactorily. To give the latter some time to prepare itself, the elections were postponed ostensibly because of the cyclone disaster in late 1970, which claimed nearly 1 million Bengali lives. But the failure of the army to provide any adequate flood relief only intensified the deep anger of the Bengali masses. When the different Maoist factions in East Bengal decided to boycott the elections, the Awami League was given a free hand. The result of the December general election gave it a title victory. Of the 169 seats allocated to East Pakistan in the National Assembly, the League won 167 and it gained 291 out of the 343 seats in the Provincial Assembly. Its bloc in National Assembly gave it an overall majority throughout the country and entitled it to form the central government. Such a prospect traumatized the West Pakistani ruling oligarchy. Given that the Awami THIRD League had fought the elections on the basis of the 6 points and had indeed on occasion surpassed them in its electoral rhetoric, it was clear that the army would try to prevent a meeting of the Constituent Assembly. The 6-point program. What did the 6 points represent? They were simply an attempt to reverse a situation which had existed ever since the partition of the subcontinent. The predominantly Hindu trader and landlord class of East Bengal migrated to West Bengal, India, in 1947, leaving their businesses and lands behind them. From the very start this vacuum was filled by Biharis and non-Bengali businessmen from the western portion of the country. The economic exploitation of East Bengal, which began immediately after partition, led to an annual extraction of some 3,000 million rupees from the east by West Pakistani capital. The most important foreign exchange earner was jute, a crop produced in East Pakistan which accounted for over 50% of exports. This money was spent on capital investment in West Pakistan. The sums granted for development projects by the central government offer an interesting case study of discrimination. Between 1948 and 1951 a sum of 130 million rupees was sanctioned for development. Of this only 22% went to East Pakistan. Over the period 1948–69, the value of the resources transferred from the East amounted to $26 billion. The West Pakistani economy as a result has been heavily dependent on East Bengal, partly as a field for investment, but above all as a mine of subsidies and as a captive market. Thus the 6 points, which included both political and economic autonomy, directly threatened the immediate interests of West Pakistani capitalism. They demanded: 1. A federal system of government, parliamentary in nature and based on adult franchise. 2. Federal government shall deal only with defense and foreign affairs. All other subjects shall be dealt with by the federating state. 3. A. 2 separate, but freely convertible currencies for the two parts of the country, or b. 1 currency for the whole country. In this case, effective constitutional measures to be taken to prevent flight of capital from East to West Pakistan. 4. Power of taxation and revenue collection to be vested in the federating units and not at the centre. 5. Separate accounts for foreign exchange earnings of the two parts of the country under control of the respective governments. 6. The setting up of a militia or paramilitary force for East Pakistan. Immediately after the general election we wrote, will the Pakistan Army and the capitalist barons of West Pakistan allow these demands to go through? The answer is quite clearly no. What will probably happen is that in the short term Mujibur Rahman will be allowed to increase East Pakistan's percentage of import and export licenses and will be allocated a larger share of foreign capital investment. These are the concessions which the army will be prepared to make in the coming few months. If Rahman accepts them, he will be allowed to stay in power. If not, it will be back to business as usual in the shape of the 31. Army. Of course, there is no doubt that in the event of another military coup there will be no holding back the immense grievances of Bengal, and the desire for an independent Bengal will increase 100-fold. What follows will depend on whether Bengali revolutionaries succeed in building a revolutionary organization to pose the question of state power. If the political leadership remains in the hands of the Awami League, the result will be yet another betrayal. 4. The 6 points represented the charter of the aspirant Bengali bourgeoisie. It articulated the latter's desire to create its own regional state apparatus and to have an equal share of the capitalist cake. But this was precisely the reason why the dominant bloc in West Pakistan was opposed to these two fundamental concessions. The Pakistani army was organically hostile to the prospect of a Bengali civilian government because of the danger that it would reduce the lavish military apparatus which has been a built-in feature of the Islamabad regime since Ayub seized power in October 1958. Some idea of the enormous stake the Pakistani officer corps has in the present structure of the unitary state can be gathered from the fact that military expenditures have throughout the last decade absorbed no less than some 60% of the total state budget. In the fiscal year of 1970 alone, some $625 million were allocated for the armed forces. Awami League politicians had repeatedly denounced these colossal outlays on a military machine which was in its virtual totality non-Bengali. The 6 points meant the subtraction of Bengali taxes for its maintenance. Moreover, the army was ideologically saturated from top to bottom with racist and religious chauvinism against the Bengalis, who had traditionally been regarded as dark, weak, and infected with Hinduism. For its part, the Pakistani business class had its own extremely strong material reasons for resisting the 6 points. The complex economic system of interzonal exploitation in Pakistan is amply documented by Richard Nations elsewhere in New Left Review. It is enough to stress here that while business interests in the West no longer regard the East as an optimal field of investment, Bengal remains of vital importance to them, both as a captive market and as a source of foreign exchange. In the late 60s, between 40% and 50% of West Pakistan's exports were taken by the East at monopoly prices. Where else could West Pakistani capitalism dispose of its high-cost manufactures? Bhutto and the People's Party. The election results in West Pakistan had resulted in the emergence of Bhutto's Pakistan People's Party, PPP, as the largest Western party in the new Constituent Assembly. But other smaller parties had also emerged with significant regional bases in Baluchistan and the northwest frontier, and it was clear to Bhutto that at best he would be a junior partner in any coalition government at the centre. If the Awami League chose to govern alone, he would be acknowledged only as the leader of West Pakistan. Bhutto had won the elections in Punjab and Sindh after his party had campaigned on a platform of demagogic radicalism, land reform, extensive nationalisation, an end to the economic power of the 22 families and other improbable promises. Because of the virtual eclipse of the extreme left, he was able to pose as a socialist. His party organization, however, was an improvised assemblage of feudalists, racketeers, lawyers, and bandwagon petty bourgeois. Its electoral success owed a great deal to Bhutto's deals with powerful landlord cliques in the countryside. His pact with leading Sindhi feudalists was particularly notorious. However, the PPP also captured and confiscated the genuine popular aspirations for social change in the towns and villages. The extreme class tensions within Bhutto's electoral bloc and the hollowness of its party organization meant that the only ideological cement that could be used to hold it together was religious chauvinism, hence the illiterate slogan of the PPP, "Socialism is our economy, democracy is our policy, Islam is our religion." The overwhelming electoral success of the Awami League stunned Bhutto. It utterly upset his plans for taking power. He now emerged as the most vociferous defender of the traditional hegemony of West Pakistan, hysterically denounced the 6 points, and after confabulations with top army generals started to whip up an intensely chauvinistic atmosphere in Punjab. The assembly was scheduled to meet 3 months after the election, on March 3, RD, 1971. In collusion with the army, Bhutto now threatened not to attend any assembly unless Mujibur Rahman was willing to compromise on the 6 points. If the assembly met without him, he would unleash a civil disobedience movement in West Pakistan. Immediately after this announcement, Yahya unilaterally decided, on March 1, St. 1971, to postpone indefinitely the meeting of the National Assembly. The result was predictable. There was a spectacular explosion of public anger in East Bengal, and in the ensuing unrest the army shot down hundreds of demonstrators in its major cities. Unarmed masses were called out onto the streets by the leaders of the Awami League. The latter then watched troops firing on them, entirely unable to offer any effective initiative. A continuous general strike brought the province to a standstill. The Awami League was now forced to accept the logic of the situation, and the result was a curious situation which could be described as a kind of bourgeois caricature of dual power. The League was able to set up committees to take over the administration of key areas in the cities and countryside, only the army cantonments were outside its control. 5. The Bengali section of the local bureaucracy aligned itself with the Awami League, and the newly arrived military proconsul from Islamabad, General Tika Khan, could not be sworn in as governor because the Bengali Chief Justice of the High Court refused to administer the ceremony. But the committees were very definitely Awami League committees and had no autonomous mass character. They substituted a new authority for that of the Pakistani-controlled capitalist state in Bengal, but did not significantly alter its normal functions. Law and order was preserved, no effort was made to mobilize or arm the masses, or prepare them for the confrontation that was plainly imminent. The Awami League leaders firmly refused to declare independence, at a time when the balance of forces was more favorable than it was later to become. They had set their sights on autonomy and eagerly prepared to negotiate with the Yahya regime. In doing so they wanted to show themselves as a responsible party, concerned to preserve the existing social order. Addressing a mass meeting in Dhaka on March 7, Mujibur Rahman fulminated against intrigue, but rejected independence, much against the evident will of the masses. Having won such a large majority, he could not believe that the army would crush it by force. 6. The military coup of March. But in Islamabad the decision had been taken, no doubt after consultations with Bhutto. Staff plans were worked out to smash the Bengali national movement in a series of sharp and well-directed military blows. What the army needed was time to dispatch troop reinforcements to ensure the operation's speedy and surgical success. The Awami League leadership, confident of a compromise settlement, was only too pleased to resume negotiations. Yahya therefore flew to Dhaka, where talks started on March 15. Bhutto was also summoned and the Awami League politicians were lulled into believing that a deal was now virtually clinched. Yahya dragged out negotiations for 10 days while extra troops were quietly flown in via Ceylon. 7 On March 25 the Awami League leaders were waiting for an announcement of the settlement. It was to be a long wait. Yahya left for Rawalpindi with other West Pakistani politicians in the morning. That night the army struck. Mujibur Rahman stayed at home and awaited his captors. Others could not afford the same luxury. Tika Khan's first objective was a systematic effort to destroy the advanced elements of the Bengali working class and intelligentsia. The army shelled Dhaka University and wiped out all students and lecturers it could find. Soldiers invaded the women's hostel, raping and killing its inmates. Artillery flattened working class districts, while newspapers and trade union offices were put to the fire. Uncounted thousands were killed in the capital alone. The masses, unarmed and abandoned, attempted to fight back, without much success. Multitudes fled to the countryside. For 2 or 3 weeks after the attack of March 16, scattered units of the East Pakistan Rifles and Police Force, under Awami League leadership, fought on. Their hopelessly incorrect policy of trying to fortify themselves in provincial towns, where they provided an easy target for mechanized expeditions by the army, doomed them to rapid defeat and dispersal. By the second half of April Tika Khan was in command of all the main cities and only those combatants of the hastily formed Muddy Fujay Liberation Army, who had taken to the countryside survived. Yahya's army had scored every initial success, yet it had also signed and sealed the death warrant of Pakistan as a state. For it had crippled the only force which could have temporarily contained the rise of the mass movement, the Awami League. It thereby laid the future basis for a protracted armed struggle in Bengal. Imperialistic reactions. The utter inability of the League to grasp or deal with the dynamic turn of events should not be blamed on individual leaders. It was a result of the party's inherent addiction to bourgeois constitutionalism. It is clear that even today the lessons of March have not been learnt by it. The bulk of the surviving Awami League leadership, led by Tajuddin Ahmed, Mujibur's number 2, sits in Calcutta platonically relying on the international bourgeoisie for aid. The provisional government of Bangladesh exists by courtesy of the Indian ruling class. Its ministers, all of them verbose parliamentarians, continue to behave in the same old way. They still preach the politics of pressure. Awami League envoys now tour the world telling their audiences that persuasion of their governments to halt aid to the Yahya regime should be considered as important as the opening of a second front. It is obvious that this sort of activity, in fact, constitutes the first front for the Awami League. It goes without saying that to waste time, energy and resources in hoping that US imperialism will disarm the Pakistani army, a vital component of its system for blocking social revolution in South Asia, is to harbor the most empty illusions. The West Pakistani state machine is a tangible and reliable entity capable of guaranteeing imperialist interests and mediating them with those of the local landlord and capitalist classes. The Awami League, however pro-American the subjective sentiments of its leaders, has always been a woefully inadequate substitute for it as an objective vehicle of imperialist domination. Not only has the absence of any solid pre-existent state apparatus in Bengal, with the proper police and army, been a decisive deterrent to any real US backing for secessionism. The Awami League, even as a party, has always fallen well short of the qualities necessary to induce imperialism to entrust it with the responsibility of creating a new one. It is not a structured mass organization, with a genuine cadre system or party discipline. It is a shapeless collection of political notables and their followers, which has never proved that it can really handle the forces to its left, and prevent their capture of its own rank and file. Faced with a choice between Mujib and Yahya, the major imperialist powers naturally and unhesitatingly refused to gamble on the former, and concluded that they must continue to sustain the regime in Islamabad. An Indian invasion of East Bengal is, of course, a possibility, although there is no need to point out its consequences for the real independence of Bangladesh. Such a prospect is undoubtedly more congenial to the leaders of the Awami League than that of themselves organizing armed struggle for national liberation. Whatever happens, it is likely that a split will develop inside the Awami League in the very near 35 future, as many of its younger militants decide to go their own way. Today that way leads only to the revolutionary left. The Awami League is already a much diminished force, as a consequence of its disastrous blunders. Its fate, and that of the movement it led, is a terrible indictment of the ideology it espoused. Once again, it confirms the fact that in this epoch the petty bourgeoisie is not capable of carrying through a real struggle for national independence. Moreover, the class limitations of the outlook of the League were compounded by the congenital defect of all such political formations on the Indian subcontinent, constitutionalism. This pathetic strain in turn reflects the low historical level of the struggle against the British. A recent commentator in the Indian press candidly noted this common element of Indo-Pakistani bourgeois politics, in expressing his sympathy for Sheikh Mujib. The Awami League leadership in many ways corresponds to the leadership of our own Congress, a leadership which, with the backing of peaceful agitation, sought to arrive and ultimately succeeded in arriving at compromises with our colonialist masters. Our independence was the result of an understanding with the British masters. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman hoped to pull off a comparable deal with Islamabad. Like the Congress in India, the Awami League does not have the stomach for the type of war circumstances have forced Bangladesh to wage. 8. These musings, of course, unwittingly point to a very important difference between British and Pakistani colonialism in the subcontinent. British imperialism was able to grant a political decolonization because it nowhere meant the abandonment of its real economic empire, whose central segments were Malayan rubber and tin, Middle Eastern oil and South African gold, or Indian plantations. But the loss of political control of East Bengal would have affected the vital interests of the impoverished and wretched subcolonialism of Islamabad directly. For the weaker a colonial power, the more dependent it is on formal political possession of its subject territories. Contemporary history has a striking lesson for us in this respect. The European imperialism, which has waged the longest and most stubborn war for the retention of its overseas possessions, was not industrialized England, France, or even Belgium. It is the small, backward and predominantly agrarian society of Portugal. For 11 years now, Lisbon has fought a ferocious and unremitting campaign in Africa to keep Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea, because of the enormous economic and ideological importance to it of these colonies. The subcolonialism of Portugal, whose own economy is deeply penetrated by the capital investment of the advanced imperialist powers, might furnish an instructive comparison with that of Pakistan. Neither has much politico-economic room for maneuver, both are in their different ways consequently driven to extreme and unmediated measures of repression. The revolutionary left, the Awami League, has been deeply discredited and weakened by the onset of the war in Bangladesh. Its catastrophic failures have cleared. 36. 8. Ranajit Roy, Hindustan Standard, May 20, th. 1971. The path for the assumption of political leadership in the underground struggle against the military occupation by the revolutionary left. What is the current condition, and what are the prospects, of the left? It has been seen how, prior to the 1968-69 upsurge, the whole development of its numerically most significant sector that under Maoist influence was warped by the friendship proclaimed by the Chinese government for Ayub's military dictatorship in Pakistan. The effusive relationship between the two states had disastrous effects on the development of the left throughout Pakistan. In particular, it greatly facilitated the rise of the Awami League and the Pakistan People's Party. 9. However, the bulk of the revolutionary left in East Bengal learnt its lesson during the great upheaval in 1968-69. The National Awami Party had traditionally functioned as an umbrella organization of the left in East Bengal, under the dominance of a heteroclite pro-Peking majority. By 1969-70 the largest of the groups within this majority was the East Bengal Communist Party, led by Alauddin, Madan, Basar and Biswas. It numbered perhaps 2,000 militants. Its main regional strongholds were the Rajshahi, Chittagong, and Pabna districts. Although it was by now too late to reverse in the short run the effects of previous opportunism on the masses, the influence of the Awami League was at its zenith in this period. This tendency made a decisive turn, in two ways. 1. It grasped the central importance of the national question and conducted agitation for a socialist solution to it. 2. It started to prepare its own cadres for a long-term armed struggle. In other words, the EBCP grasped the essential specificity of class struggle in East Bengal, and rejected from the outset all electoralist illusions. The three other pro-Chinese groups within the NAP gradually shifted in a similar direction, although with more hesitation. The Coordinating Committee for Communist Revolutionaries, whose leaders were Rashid Khan Mainan and Qazi Zafar, was a smaller nucleus centered in Dhaka itself. The veteran peasant leader Maulana Bashani, himself no theoretician, was surrounded by a group of personal supporters who formed another current. Finally, Muhammad Toha and Abdul Haq, the former an experienced trade union militant who had once been Bashani's secretary, formed the East Pakistan Communist Party, Marxist-Leninist. As its name suggests, this was the most rigidly orthodox group, in that it alone rejected the Bengali right to self-determination and insisted on the necessity of preserving the unitary state of Pakistan, a theme to which China was, for reasons of its own, particularly attached. It, too, was the only group to reject united action in the developing crisis from 1968 onwards. The other tendencies cooperated in implementing the boycott strategy of the NAP in the March elections, and in radicalizing the demands of the base of the Awami League. However, it should be stressed that all four groups adopted an identical position in one fundamental respect. None of them harbored any illusions about either the capabilities of the Awami League 11 or the intentions of Yahya Khan. By early March, their cadres were alerted and instructed to go underground, many of them leaving Dhaka and heading for their respective bases in the countryside. Thus not many leftist cadres were eliminated by the military blitz of March 25. The only important leader to have been captured was the student spokesman in Dhaka, Mahbubullah, a militant of the EBCP and one of the most talented Marxists in East Bengal. He had already been imprisoned in Dhaka before the onslaught, and his comrades fear that he may have been subsequently killed. Investigations in Bengal suggest that after the army's attack, the military tactics adopted by the guerrilla units of the revolutionary groups have differed markedly from those of the regular soldiers and police enlisted under the banner of the Awami League. Thus an EBCP group in the Pabna area, led by Tipu Biswas, constantly harassed the army garrison in Pabna, drew it out of its cantonment, and after a week-long battle destroyed it. The guerrillas then occupied the city, ignored the hostility of the local Awami League, seized the arsenal and distributed arms to the local population. They did not dig in and establish positions, but thereafter left the city. Such an experience is in evident contrast with the positional warfare employed by the League-dominated Muddy Fujay in early April, which led to its utter rout in the cities. It would be a mistake to exaggerate the size of the small detachments of the revolutionary left, who are now struggling to entrench themselves in the waterways and hills of East Bengal. No mass organization of the left existed prior to March 1971, and one will not be created overnight. At the moment, scattered nuclei of revolutionaries are attacking and disrupting the army communications and installations where they can, in their own localities. The EBCP in the Rajshahi Pabna zone to the northeast of the province, the EPCP, ML, reportedly in the Noakhali district in the Ganges Delta, Toha's home territory. They are undertrained and under-equipped. The terrain is not uniformly hospitable to guerrilla warfare. The flat plains of the east do not afford extensive cover, and water transport can increase army mobility. The hill country in the west, behind Chittagong, Kumala, and Sylhet, is more intractable. 12. However, it is perfectly clear that Tika Khan's occupation forces have not succeeded in re-establishing normal trunk communications in the province. The bridges between Chittagong, the only deep water port of entry for goods into the country, and Dhaka were blown up in April, halting all rail traffic between the two. Goods are presently being shipped up the delta by barge. Economic life remains largely at a standstill. Many of the cities have become ghost towns with isolated military cantonments in the middle of them. The stage is thus set for a people's war, even if the full drama itself has yet to unfold. The task of the Bengali revolutionary groups is clearly twofold. first to coordinate and unify their struggles on a national scale, and secondly to win the poor peasantry and proletariat firmly to the socialist road to independence. Only correct political practice and leadership can ensure ultimate military victory. The revolutionary groups engaged in the struggle understand this, and Awami League does not. That is why the future should belong to them. Our latest information indicates that these groups, with the exception of the EPCP, ML, have united in a National Liberation Front, whose objective is to pose a revolutionary alternative to the provisional government in Calcutta. The EPCP, ML, traditionally the most orthodox of the Maoist groups, while organizationally apart, is nevertheless committed to a common struggle. The role of China. Yet if the pro-Peking currents are today actively involved in the armed struggle, they are fighting despite the positions adopted by the Chinese government, and without its help, moral or material. The Chinese leaders have given unconditional and blanket approval to the Yahya regime in its attempt to crush the Bengali resistance. Their support has extended far beyond state diplomacy. It has faithfully echoed the ideological justifications offered by the Islamabad military clique for its genocide in Bengal. Yahya has claimed that the whole upheaval was the result of a handful of separatist leaders of the Awami League conspiring in concert with the Indian government. The official West Pakistan propaganda machine has presented the revolt of an entire people as Indian interference. The Chinese government has publicly endorsed this myth. In a fulsome personal letter to Yahya Khan, Premier Zhou Enlai openly accepted and defended the right of the Pakistani army to trample on the aspirations of an oppressed people. 13. The Chinese government has thus deliberately aligned itself with a murderously reactionary capitalist state against a mass popular upsurge, which included many supporters of the Chinese Revolution. The Chinese justification that they are upholding the unity and sovereignty of Pakistan is grotesque. The Pakistani state, as every socialist militant must be aware, is a uniquely reactionary and anti-national construct. It is, in fact, one of the only two confessional states in the world. The other is Israel. The People's Republic of China now apparently maintains that the sacred ties of religion are indissoluble. In fact, of course, the basic right of national self-determination, a fundamental principle of Marxism and Leninism, has scarcely ever belonged so unequivocally to a people as to the oppressed masses of East Bengal, who are not only ethnically, historically, linguistically, and culturally a distinct community, but who constitute the majority of the population of Pakistan anyway. The class nature of the state machine which now enforces the unity of Pakistan is equally plain. It is the repressive weapon of the landlord capitalist ruling class against millions of poor peasants and workers. The Pakistani army is a shock force of imperialist-trained and Pentagon-backed coercion, which has not only tyrannized its own country for the past 12 years. It has been an integral component of Sento and Sito, has provided officers and troops for the feudal despotism of Oman against the popular revolt in Dhofar, 14, and advised and assisted King Hussein in maintaining the monarchy in Jordan. Moreover, China has by no means limited itself to merely verbal support for this army and its dictatorship in Pakistan. Its military and economic assistance has been crucial to the Yahya regime. The tanks used to raise workers' districts in Dhaka were Chinese-made. The fighter bombers which fly over Bengal are Chinese-constructed. When Islamabad confronted a grave economic crisis because of its war, Peking stepped into the breach with a generous loan of $100 million, delivered to Yahya free of interest. 15. Meanwhile, the newly opened 4-lane highway which links Sinkiang with northwest Pakistan across the Karakoram, from Sufra to Gilgit, has been a constant conduit for both military and civilian supplies to the Pakistani regime, throughout the crisis. Already in early March, when the general strike in East Bengal halted shipments of paper to the west, Chinese trucks were bringing newsprint south to keep the official presses running in Pakistan. 16 later, when the war itself had started, 100 lorries a day were reported to be doing the run to Gilgit, with military supplies for the ordnance depots in Peshawar and Rawalpindi. 17. There can be no doubt that this assistance has been of direct benefit to the cause of counter-revolution in Pakistan. However, the Pakistan army remains greatly extended in East Bengal. The next 6 months will be decisive in determining the long-term course of the struggle and the tactics followed by the fledgling NLF are, therefore, of great importance. Whatever the advantages of the Pakistani army, it is clear that there will be a lengthy struggle and that it will, before long, extend beyond the geographical limits of Bangladesh itself. The consequences of Bangladesh. The revolutionary crisis in Bengal is already beginning to have its effects elsewhere. Its echoes are being heard today both in West Pakistan and in West Bengal. The quick and clear victory sought by the Pakistani generals has been denied them. This has seriously affected both the Indian and Pakistani ruling class, both of whose interests demand a rapid conclusion to the struggle. 1. West Pakistan. The army's oft-repeated claim that it is independent of vested interests has been finally exposed. Indeed, the whole historical role of the military and bureaucratic state apparatus which Pakistan inherited from British rule in India has now emerged into the light of day for many young Pakistanis. This role was in many ways a peculiarly central and concentrated one in Pakistan, setting it off from that of most other Asian and African countries, despite the formal similarities of the military regimes which exist in them today. In Southeast Asia, Japanese invasion and occupation during the Second World War temporarily smashed the old colonial apparatuses of government which had anyway never had a very large indigenous quotient in Burma, Indonesia and elsewhere. After the war, there was little chance for the imperialist powers to reconstitute these, and considerable sections of the armed forces and civil services which emerged in the post-independence period had often participated in a national liberation struggle against either Japanese or European oppressors. In Africa, on the other hand, the colonial administrations were usually staffed so completely by the colonizing power itself that a civilian bureaucracy and above all an army had to build up virtually from scratch after independence had been granted. On the Indian subcontinent, however, neither of these two patterns prevailed. There, a large and locally recruited civil service was an absolute necessity, since the British could not hope themselves to staff the bulk of the administrative system necessary to control its immense population. The same situation obliged them simultaneously to create an extremely large Indian army, whose junior and some senior officers were recruited from the feudal aristocracy of the subcontinent. 18 These troops did sterling service for their imperialist masters both in the First and Second World Wars, and in constant domestic repression at home. No other colonial power could boast of such a capacious sepoy force. A precondition of it was, of course, the ethnic heterogeneity of India, which allowed the British to recruit their mercenary army from selected martial races, mainly Punjabis, Sikhs, Pathans, Rajputs, Jats, and Dogras, who could be relied on to keep down the other subject nationalities of the empire. However, in India the Congress Party led a strong bourgeois independence movement from the 20s onwards, which built a mass organisation in the countryside, and succeeded in levering Britain out of its imperial suzerainty after it had been fatally weakened by the Second World War. The Congress Party was then able itself to knit the state together and dominate a parliamentary system that has survived ever since. The scenario in Pakistan was very different. The Muslim League was always an extremely weak organization by comparison. Originally created by Islamic princes and nobles in 1906 to foster a sense of loyalty to the British government among the Muslims of India, to cite from its statement of aims, it was captured by the educated Muslim middle class led by Jinnah in the 1930s and for a brief period was in alliance with the Congress Party. However, its main thrust was always anti-Hindu rather than anti-British. It collaborated with the Raj during the Second World War and received a separate state from it in 1947, without having seriously struggled for independence. Jinnah became the Governor-General of Pakistan without having ever created a substantial party organization, let alone one of a mass character. The UP, one of the main regions of the Muslim bourgeoisie he represented, was not included in the new state. Largely a stranger to the present provinces of West Pakistan, he simply confirmed the provincial landlords and feudalists in power as the representatives of his party there. The result was that the ruling class in Pakistan never possessed a reliable political party capable of mystifying or controlling the masses. The Muslim League became merely a clutch of corrupt and quarrelsome caciques who soon discredited it permanently. Pakistan was thus from the outset firmly dominated by its civilian bureaucracy and army, both of which had faithfully served the British. The top echelons of each were composed of an exclusive upper-class elite, handpicked and trained for its tasks by British imperialism. In the first decade after partition, the civilian bureaucracy exercised political paramountcy in Pakistan. The CSP civil service of Pakistan comprised a closed oligarchy of 500 functionaries commanding the state. Indeed, the two masterful heads of state of this period, Ghulam Muhammad and Iskandar Mirza, were co-opted directly from its ranks. They manipulated the token parliamentarism of the time, until it became so discredited that in 1958 a military coup was engineered which brought Ayub Khan to the presidency. This change was itself stage-managed by the bureaucracy, which initially wielded most of the real power. However, once in the saddle, Ayub surrounded himself with a clique of cronies and increasingly made his regime into a personal dictatorship, although not yet a corporate dictatorship of the army as such. There were no military ministers in the cabinet, for example. A decade later, Ayub's regime had in its turn become so immensely unpopular that it provoked the largest social upheaval in the history of the country. It was henceforward useless to the ruling class. Thus, in the emergency of early 1969, with masses on the streets in Rawalpindi, Lahore, Karachi, Dhaka, and Chittagong, and continuous strikes and riots in both east and west, the army dislodged Ayub and finally assumed direct political command. The Yahya regime represents the end of a slow shift in the intrastate complex of power from the civilian to the military apparatus. Naturally, the CSP remains very influential within the present government. Key civilian bureaucrats still concern themselves with those manifold problems of running the state machine and the economy which were beyond the competence of the army officers. But the military are now the senior partner. 42. The army and its regime. The Pakistani army is a force of 300,000 troops, mostly recruited from those sections of the Punjabi and Pathan peasantry who traditionally provided infantry for the British. 70,000 of them are now deployed in Bengal. The officer corps, from the critical rank of lieutenant colonel upwards, is a select elite screened with the utmost care for its class background and political outlook. The generals, brigadiers, and colonels of the Pakistani army are scions of the feudal aristocracy and gentry of Punjab and the northwest frontier, with a sprinkling of wealthy immigrants from Up, Gujarat and Hyderabad. The impeccable social credentials and English accents of this group, which so entrance British journalists, reveal their past. They were trained as mercenary thugs for imperialism in Sandhurst or Dehradun. So much so, that the first commander-in-chief of the Pakistani army after independence was actually the British General Gracie, whose 20th Indian Division seized Saigon and thereby started the Indochina War in 1945. 19. The Punjabi regiments now engaged in repression in Bengal thus include units who once practiced their trade in Vietnam. Tika Khan, the butcher of Dhaka, is a veteran of Montgomery's army in the North African campaign. Supreme power in Islamabad today is exercised by a small circle of these military officers, flanked by a few civilian advisors and accomplices. Yahya Khan himself is a dim and slothful figurehead. The clique which rules behind him includes some 5 generals: Hamid, the deputy CNC of the army; Umar Khan, the chairman of the National Security Council; Akbar Khan, the chief of the Inter-Services Intelligence Committee; Pirzada, the Deputy Chief Martial Law Administrator, and Tika Khan, now Governor of East Bengal. 20. To these should be added the regime's top civilian bureaucrat Muzaffar Mohammad Ahmed, Chairman of the Planning Commission and heir to the tradition of Ghulam Muhammad and Iskandar Mirza in an earlier epoch. The strength of this group lies in the very intensity of the social conflicts unleashed in Pakistan since 1968-69. Like all political expressions of class rule, the Pakistani army and civil bureaucracy have always enjoyed a certain relative autonomy from the landlords and businessmen of West Pakistan. 21. But unfortunately for the West Pakistani ruling class, the converse does not hold. Since the mass upsurge of 1968-69, the oligarchy in the West has become more and more acutely aware of its dependence on the continued strength of the military and civilian state machine. The army and its cohesion is thus needed as a political rallying point over and above its purely repressive functions. The 6 points of March 1971 thus struck at the heart of oligarchic rule in the West. This is what explains the refusal to compromise with the Awami League, the ferocity of the action against the East, and the remarkable degree of unanimity in West Pakistani ruling circles in immediately supporting the coup of March 25. It is also what explains the fidelity of US and British imperialism to the military regime, despite the fact that it has jeopardized stability in Bengal. At the present time, the USA is trying to inflect the Pakistani dictatorship towards moderation, while shoring it up otherwise. Economic pressure will doubtless be used to render it more understanding of the international interests of world capitalism, which have hitherto been somewhat sacrificed to its narrow national egoism. It would be logical to drop Yahya himself, whose feeble intelligence and inertia are an embarrassment anyway, and whose disappearance could be suitably used to give the government a fresh look. But unless he could be prevailed on to resign voluntarily, his ouster might present some problems. The Pakistani military, steeped in British conventions, have hitherto always respected strict hierarchy of rank. Both Ayub and Yahya, when they assumed power in 1958 and 1969 respectively, were commander-in-chief of the army, and formally acted in an ex officio capacity. A Middle East-style putsch by younger generals or colonels would be a sharp rupture with this whole tradition. Such an eventuality cannot be excluded, but it would probably only occur if the domestic situation had already deteriorated greatly. The economic and political situation. For the moment, the war in Bangladesh has badly shaken the Pakistan economy, which has been depressed anyway since 1968. Foreign exchange has dwindled drastically, while prices and unemployment have mounted. Jute exports have collapsed, precipitating steep falls on the Karachi Stock Exchange. Devaluation is probably imminent. The reason for this grave economic crisis is, of course, the cost of the expeditionary force in Bengal. Press estimates calculate this at something like $2 million a day, a massive burden when added to West Pakistan's chronic import deficit of $140 million a month. The Islamabad regime is thus faced with a domestic squeeze it did not bargain for when it embarked on its genocidal operations in March. It has already unilaterally suspended payments on its foreign debts, and will need further large infusions of imperialist aid to ward off bankruptcy. The political situation in the West is also becoming increasingly unstable. The initial wave of chauvinism which gripped the population has receded, and government propaganda that only Hindus and traders are being killed in Bengal has lost much of its effect. The main victim of the growing disillusionment of the masses has been Bhutto. His open role as a military collaborator and his efforts to act as a public relations officer for the dictatorship have fortunately destroyed much of his credibility. The People's Party is now rent by warring factions, and one group has already broken away in Punjab, denouncing Bhutto as a fascist. Many of the more sincerely militant of its cadres are either in prison for protesting against the deteriorating economic situation or for leading workers' struggles. It is worth recalling that a few days before the invasion of the East, the workers in Lyalpur, a Punjabi industrial stronghold, seized factories and hoisted the red flag. They were brutally ejected, and their leader, Mukhtar Rana, a stalwart of the local PPP, was imprisoned. He was released on bail in mid-June. On the other hand, some of Bhutto's feudal and business backers who were eagerly awaiting the fruits of office have become frustrated by the role he has played in helping to maintain military rule in the country. As a result, Bhutto has started to appeal to the dictatorship to transfer power to him in West Pakistan, and to negotiate a settlement with collaborationist Awami Leaguers in East Bengal. The fact that industry is operating far below capacity and that there is a general slump in West Pakistan could push the regime into some sort of pseudo-compromise settlement, with the United States and the Soviet Union acting as brokers. Another Tashkent may be in the offing. Whatever happens, the working class in West Pakistan will play a central role in the final political outcome. It matured very rapidly in 1968-69 and is capable of remarkable levels of militancy. The coming period may thus see the beginnings of a new mass struggle in West Pakistan by the workers against the dictatorship, which would, of course, have a serious effect on supply lines to the east. While the intelligentsia in West Pakistan has been divided and disoriented by China's policy, many student militants have nevertheless been imprisoned for precautionary reasons since March. The leadership of the small but active Kisan Mazdoor, peasant worker, party has been arrested for defying the army. A senior vice president of the Journalists' Union, Abdullah Malik, was promptly jailed for publicly declaring his solidarity with the oppressed of Bangladesh. His newspaper Azad has been banned. It is 45. 46. Becoming clear that the fog of chauvinism which descended on the country after the March invasion has here and there been lifted. The fate of the ruling class in the West is visibly bound up with that of the military machine it has unleashed on the East. Every blow struck against it by the liberation forces in Bangladesh will be a blow in aid of the oppressed masses in the West. A military debacle in the Bengali countryside would open up completely new perspectives for the revolutionary movement in West Pakistan. The latter country now becomes a weak link in the imperialist chain of domination in South Asia. 2. West Bengal. A protracted struggle in Bangladesh will have critical repercussions in West Bengal. The latter province has been in the throes of profound social crisis for 3 years now, and only the inadequacy of the left has postponed a revolutionary explosion. West Bengal is a powder keg, and the Indian bourgeoisie, although far stronger than its Pakistani counterpart, is well aware of it. That is why Indira Gandhi was so quick in her demagogic response to the events in East Bengal. Every opposition party in India has been urging New Delhi to intervene more forcefully. However, Indira Gandhi's policy has been to prop up the Awami League, while repeatedly disarming guerrillas crossing the border and instituting strict political control over the so-called training camps set up on Indian soil. Although it enjoys great military superiority, the Indian bourgeoisie has so far evidently been daunted by the prospect of an invasion of East Bengal, which would anger its imperialist patrons and plunge the whole region into a turmoil which New Delhi fears it could not control. But whatever it does, the forces of the revolutionary left are likely to grow in the field of struggle in Bangladesh itself, and this cannot but encourage revolutionary developments in the other half of Bengal. Indeed, even if the Awami League had succeeded in establishing what Indira Gandhi calls a secular and democratic state in East Bengal, the weakness of the indigenous bourgeoisie and the virtual absence of a developed state apparatus would have posed the question of permanent revolution there with great rapidity. Whatever course the Indian ruling class adopts, it will confront serious perils to its own future. At present, the most effective political force in West Bengal itself is undoubtedly the CPI-M, with its tens of thousands of militants and millions of supporters. The centrist limitations of this party were clearly revealed when it formed a coalition state government in the province, though it allows itself more revolutionary rhetoric now that it is in opposition. It argues that Indira Gandhi and Yahya Khan represent equally reactionary social and political forces. It still does not seek a decisive confrontation with the Indian state, however, and like the Indonesian Communist Party seems to imagine that its large size is a sure guarantee of its continued influence. It argues that just as East Bengal is specially exploited by West Pakistan, so West Bengal is specially exploited by the Indian centre. The collapse on June 26 of the West Bengal government and its replacement yet again by a central 47 governor only confirms this view. However, it refuses to draw what would appear to be the logical conclusion from this and develop a strategy for a united socialist Bengal. To think in such terms would necessitate a break with parliamentarism, and its record suggests that it will not be capable of making this. But it must be added that the party continues to have within its ranks a mass of sincere and dedicated revolutionaries who feel they have no better alternative. The Naxalite groups are split into several factions in West Bengal, and there is a certain demoralization among them because of the lethally effective repression to which they have been subjected. The police force has quite consciously sought to kill as many Naxalites as it can, and the CPI-M made no move to protect them. On Bangladesh, the Naxalites are in disarray because of the Chinese statements, though undoubtedly a majority of them support armed struggle against Yahya Khan. At a mass public meeting in Shantipur near the border in April 1971, the Naxalites associated themselves with the speech of a leading Trotskyist militant who declared that the best way to help Bangladesh was to extend the struggle against the Indian bourgeoisie. It is safe to surmise that the idea of a united socialist Bengal will be increasingly discussed among the revolutionary vanguard, while the governments of Indira Gandhi and Yahya Khan seek to suppress the revolutionary left on both sides of the border, and join in striking harmony to assist in the repression of the revolutionary movement in Ceylon. Whatever form it took, a Red Bengal would sound the death knell of imperialist domination over the Indian subcontinent, and that is why the Indo-Pak ruling classes will wage a bitter struggle to prevent any possibility of it. 22. Bengal, historically in the vanguard of the anti-British imperialist struggle, the area which gave birth to the Indian revolutionary movement, may once again play a pilot role. The first shots have already been fired in a struggle to liberate a small portion of the peninsula. Whether those who fired them realize it or not, these shots may herald the beginning of a long process which would decisively change the map of the world, the subcontinental revolution.